It began with tension so thick, even the cameras hesitated. Vice President J.D. Vance stood at the edge of the Senate well, his jaw clenched, eyes locked on Senator John Fetterman. Behind them, a contentious vote on a mental health and veterans aid bill had just stalled. Again. J.D. had fought hard for that bill. He'd visited VA hospitals across the country, listened to veterans sob about sleepless nights, broken families, lost friends. He knew the numbers. He knew the names. Some he still texted. But today, John Fetterman, usually reserved, often misunderstood, had pushed back. Not because he didn't care, but because, in his words, this bill doesn't go far enough. The room froze as J.D. stepped forward, the microphone barely catching his words. You think this isn't far enough? You have any idea what these families are going through? Fetterman didn't flinch. I do, he replied, steady, because I am one of those families. Gasps echoed from the back. J.D.'s face changed, just for a moment, but emotions were rising, and what followed, no one could have predicted, not even J.D. himself. Just days before this confrontation, J.D. had returned from a visit to Camp Lejeune. He wasn't there for press. He had quietly slipped into a support group, no cameras, no staff, where 12 broken men sat in folding chairs, staring at the floor. Each had attempted suicide within the last year. J.D. listened for 2 hours without speaking. One of them, a young father named Miguel, held up a tattered photo of his daughter and whispered, I stayed alive for her. Barely. Miguel had served with distinction in Afghanistan. Then, he came home to silence, to nightmares, to a system that made him feel invisible. J.D. hadn't been the same since that night. He flew back to D.C. with fire in his chest and tears he hadn't let fall. He wasn't fighting for numbers in a budget. He was fighting for Miguel. And when Fetterman challenged the bill's scope on the Senate floor, it struck a nerve J.D. hadn't yet found words for. That's why J.D.'s voice broke as he said, You don't get to delay this, not one more day. And yet, Fetterman didn't raise his voice. He just whispered, You don't know what I've lost either. Fetterman's words hung in the air like a funeral bell. You don't know what I've lost either. J.D. blinked. His anger cooled, but his confusion deepened. The chamber around them stayed eerily still. Even the senators who usually heckled and murmured kept their mouths shut. Then Fetterman did something J.D. didn't expect. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded letter, worn at the edges. My cousin, he said, voice raw. Marine. Came home from Iraq and never made it out of the basement. He held up the letter. It's his suicide note. J.D. stepped back, breath caught in his throat. The cameras zoomed in, but neither man seemed to care. Fetterman's eyes glassed over. I'm not here to block your bill. I want more. I want everything these men were promised. And suddenly, J.D. saw it. Not a challenge, but a mirror. A man who had also been hollowed out by grief. Different paths, same battlefield. And for the first time in his career, J.D. Vance, the warrior, the fighter, the vice president, found himself speechless. But something inside him had just shifted, and the hug the world would never forget was only seconds away. The Senate floor was dead silent. J.D. Vance, still holding Senator Fetterman's suicide note in his trembling hand, took one careful step closer. The vice president's lips parted slightly. And then he leaned in. What J.D. whispered will never be known to the public. The microphones didn't catch it. The cameras zoomed, but they caught only a quiet motion. And the look in J.D.'s eyes. But Fetterman's face changed. Whatever J.D. had said, it broke something open. Fetterman nodded once, just once. His shoulders dropped, and for the first time in years, his guard melted. And then it happened. J.D. extended his arm, slowly, and pulled John Fetterman into an embrace. A genuine human hug. No politics, No calculation, no speeches. Just two broken men holding on in the middle of a chamber built for power. No one moved. Some senators covered their mouths. One aide in the gallery wiped tears. This wasn't strategy. It was survival. Later, a camera caught JD whispering just one more thing into Fetterman's ear. "We've both lost people, but we won't lose this fight." It wasn't a deal. It was a promise. And America was watching. 3 hours later, JD sat alone in his Senate office. No press conference, no tweets, just silence and a framed photo on his desk. It was a picture of his grandfather, James Donald Vance Sr., the man he was named after. A proud veteran, a quiet man, one of the lucky ones who made it home, but never really came back. JD remembered the long silences at family dinners, the locked door to the garage, the way he never talked about the war. He remembered the phone call when his uncle, James's son, took his own life. The grief rippling through the family like a grenade with no sound. And now here he was, the Vice President of the United States, trying to pass a bill that still wasn't enough. JD stood and walked to a nearby drawer. Inside was a list, names of veterans lost to suicide in the last 12 months. He carried it everywhere. Miguel's name was on that list too. JD pressed the paper to his chest. "Not one more," he whispered. That's why the hug happened. That's why he broke protocol. Because this wasn't about politics anymore. It was about ghosts and unfinished business. That night across town, Senator John Fetterman sat alone in his apartment. No aides, no advisors, just the note, his cousin Dave's final words, written shakily on a hospital napkin in 2017. He'd found it stuffed in a shoebox years after Dave's death. Dave had never meant for anyone to see it. "I'm tired of fighting. I don't hate anyone. I just don't belong anywhere anymore." Fetterman had carried that guilt like an anchor. Every time he tried to talk about mental health in the Senate, he felt like he was betraying Dave's silence. He hadn't planned to show the letter today. But when JD Vance exploded with passion, something cracked open. Because deep down, Fetterman had been waiting for someone, anyone, in that chamber to understand what it felt like. And JD did. That hug wasn't planned. It wasn't staged. It was two men screaming without sound, finally finding each other in the chaos. Fetterman picked up his phone and texted JD a single sentence. "Let's fix this together." And JD replied 2 minutes later, "First thing tomorrow, I'll bring the names." The war wasn't over, but they had just won the first battle. Together. The next morning, just as the Capitol dome lit with pale sunrise, JD Vance received a phone call that hit like a freight train. It was from Clara, the widow of a Marine who had written JD 3 months ago. She'd thanked him for visiting their hospital in Dayton, Ohio, for speaking to her husband Josh, who'd battled PTSD for years. But this call was different. "Josh is gone," Clara whispered, her voice hollow. JD sat in his office chair, staring at the photo on his desk, a grainy shot of him shaking Josh's hand just weeks earlier. "He said he felt hope after meeting you. He tried. But last night, he didn't make it." JD didn't respond for a long time. The pain in his chest was sharp, suffocating. And then Clara said something that would stay with him forever. "Don't stop, please. Whatever you're doing, finish it." When he hung up, JD looked at the letter from Fetterman's cousin still lying on his desk. 2 broken men, 2 families in mourning, 1 mission. JD stood up slowly and picked up the revised draft of the bill. Today wasn't about politics anymore. It was personal. That afternoon, JD and Fetterman met behind closed doors. No media, no handlers, no distractions. Just 2 men, seated across from each other, surrounded by yellow notepads and silence. Fetterman broke it first. "I didn't sleep last night," he said, rubbing his temple. "I kept thinking about the hug, about Dave. JD didn't speak. He slid across the new draft of the bill, now titled the Joshua Dave Veteran Care Act. Fetterman's hand froze as he read the names. You renamed it? I did, JD replied. Because this isn't about legacy. It's about keeping people alive. Fetterman swallowed hard. His voice broke. Thank you. They spent the next 2 hours going line by line, adding, removing, strengthening it. They added mental health crisis teams to rural areas, increased funding for family support groups, built in long-term housing for homeless veterans, and a hotline, not just for veterans, but for their spouses and kids too. For every item, JD thought of Clara, Miguel, and his grandfather, and Fetterman thought of Dave. The hug had been the beginning, but this was how healing started. Together. What happened next wasn't planned. A staffer leaked a photo, taken secretly from outside the glass-paneled meeting room. It showed JD and Fetterman, both hunched over a single sheet of paper, JD's hand on Fetterman's shoulder. Within an hour, it exploded across every platform online. This is what leadership looks like. I don't care who you voted for, this made me cry. Finally, someone in Washington is doing something real. News anchors choked up on air. Veterans posted teary-eyed videos. One father in Nebraska shared that he hadn't hugged his son, a former Marine, in 5 years. After seeing the hug, he did. The clip of JD whispering into Fetterman's ear replayed endlessly. Every commentator speculated what was said, but no one could guess. Because it wasn't about the words, it was about the weight of the forgotten. That night, under the Capitol dome, candlelight vigils appeared across the country. Names were spoken aloud. Pain was remembered, but for the first time in a long time, hope was too. And the bill? It was almost ready. Almost. Just 2 days after the leaked photo went viral, J.D. Vance walked into a committee meeting expecting support. What he got was betrayal. A quiet but powerful senator from his own party, someone he'd trusted, stood and proposed a reduction to the veteran care funding in the Joshua Dave bill. The reason? We simply don't have the budget. J.D. stared in disbelief. We had a budget for foreign contracts, for bank bailouts, but not for the men who gave us everything. The room went cold. Fetterman, seated across the table, locked eyes with J.D., a silent, shared fury between them. That night, news broke that a lobbying group connected to the pharmaceutical industry had pressured several senators to weaken the bill. Less focus on therapy, more focus on meds. It wasn't just politics. It was sabotage. And J.D. knew, if this passed in its watered-down form, Clara's husband would have died for nothing. The hug, the hope, it was all on the line. He stood before a row of cameras and made a promise. If they bury this bill in red tape, I will bury my career in fighting back. It was nearly midnight when J.D. returned to the vice president's residence, exhausted, angry, torn between duty and despair. That's when the letter arrived. It came in a plain white envelope. No return address, just 2 words scrawled on the back. For J.D. Inside was a drawing, crude, made with crayon. It showed a stick figure in a hospital bed, smiling, next to another stick figure labeled me. A child's handwriting ran across the top. Thank you for helping my daddy. He's home now. J.D.'s hand shook. He read the letter once, then twice, and when he reached the end, a simple line that said, "My dad says you're a real hero." He fell into the nearest chair and wept. It wasn't staged, it wasn't televised, just a father fighting for other fathers. Fetterman texted him at 1:04 a.m. I'm with you. Let's not back down. Not now. Not ever. And J.D. responded, then let's finish what we started. March 14th, 2025. J.D. Vance took the Senate floor with the bill in hand, the unedited version, the one he and Fetterman had poured their pain into. The room was full, every senator present, reporters pressed against glass above, the world watching. J.D. didn't raise his voice. Instead, he told a story. He spoke about Josh in Ohio, about Dave in Pennsylvania, about Clara and the child's letter. He ended with his own grandfather, a Vietnam vet who died quietly in a rehab center, unseen and forgotten. And then, with tears rising in his throat, J.D. looked across the chamber and said, "If we can't protect the people who protected us, then this building doesn't deserve to stand." The chamber was silent. Even the critics, even the ones who had tried to gut the bill, didn't speak. Cameras zoomed in. J.D.'s eyes glistened, but his jaw stayed firm. And just as he finished, John Fetterman rose from his seat. He clapped once, then again. Then the chamber echoed with applause, slow, unsure, then thunderous. The vote was just hours away, and everything now came down to one final twist. The chamber doors closed at exactly 3 p.m. Senators filed into their seats, some still unsure, others visibly shaken by J.D. Vance's speech. The bill, the full version of the Joshua Dave Veteran Mental Health Act, sat atop the mahogany desk. One piece of paper. Years of sacrifice behind it. Vice President J.D. Vance stood above the Senate floor, silent, gripping the gavel. It was the first time he'd ever presided over a vote so personal. Fetterman gave a small nod from across the room. The clerk began to call names. Senator Booker, aye. Senator Cruz, nay. Senator Duckworth, aye. J.D.'s eyes scanned the room like a father waiting for a diagnosis. Every vote landed like a drumbeat in his chest. Then came a pause. Senator Raymond Tilley, a Republican swing vote, hesitated. He looked up at J.D., then down at his desk, and slowly pushed the button. Aye. J.D. felt his knees weaken. The vote passed. Barely. But it passed. And just as applause began to swell, a staffer burst through the side door. "It's Senator Fetterman. He's collapsed." The halls of George Washington University Hospital buzzed with tension. J.D. Vance paced the corridor in silence, tie loosened, hands shaking. The celebration had stopped. The cameras were turned off. It was just quiet now, and fear. Fetterman had collapsed minutes after the vote. The stress, the pressure, perhaps more than his heart could bear. A nurse stepped out. J.D. rushed to her. "Is he okay?" She hesitated, then nodded. "He's stable. He asked for you." Inside the room, Fetterman lay hooked up to monitors, pale, breathing heavy, but awake. J.D. stepped in, closed the door, and walked to the side of the bed. "I should have protected you better," J.D. whispered. Fetterman gave a tired grin. "You protected them instead. That's what matters." Then, a pause. "You remember what you whispered to me on the Senate floor?" Fetterman asked. J.D. nodded. "Yeah. Say it again." J.D. leaned down and whispered, "We fight with our hearts, not just our words." Fetterman shut his eyes. A tear rolled down his cheek. "Then keep fighting, brother, no matter what happens to me." And J.D., voice shaking, whispered back, "I will. I promise." 1 week later, the White House lawn was filled. Veterans in wheelchairs, children clutching flags, journalists, senators, even the ones who'd voted no. They had gathered to see something that hadn't happened in decades, a presidential-level signing of a bipartisan veteran mental health bill. President Carrick handed the pen to J.D. Vance. J.D. didn't smile. Instead, he looked out at the crowd, then down at the small envelope in his hand. The child's drawing. He'd kept it in his coat every day. Then he turned to Fetterman, seated in a wheelchair beside him, recovering. "You stood with me," J.D. said softly. "So today we stand with every soul who ever felt forgotten." He signed the bill. A camera caught a single tear rolling down his cheek. The moment was real. No script, no spin. Just two men, battered by politics, bonded by pain, doing what many had said was impossible. Across the nation, veterans cried watching the broadcast. Children wrote thank you letters to Capitol Hill. Families of lost soldiers said they finally felt seen. And somewhere in Ohio, Clara watched the screen, holding her son tight. By now, everyone had seen the hug. Millions rewatched the footage on loop, zooming in, reading lips, speculating. But no one had heard the whisper. What did J.D. Vance say to John Fetterman just before pulling him into that embrace? Only two men knew. Until now. In a quiet interview days later, J.D. was asked, again, what he'd whispered. He looked into the camera, silent for a long time. Then, gently, he answered, I lost my friend Dave in 2005. Iraq. He asked for help. We didn't answer in time. I've never forgiven myself. That day on the floor, I looked at Fetterman and I saw Dave. I whispered, we can't fail them again. The interviewer was speechless. Viewers across the country cried, veterans, widows, people who'd fought silent battles of their own. J.D. wasn't shouting. He wasn't playing politics. He was finally letting the pain show. If this job means anything, he added, it's to make sure no American in pain is left behind, not one more. And for the first time since the hug, America understood. That whisper was a vow. It arrived in a plain white envelope, no return address. Just a note scribbled on a folded napkin, slipped under J.D. Vance's office door at the White House. He opened it cautiously. There were only 3 lines. I'm still here because of you. Your hug told me I mattered. Signed, a soldier's mom. J.D. sat down in silence. All the policy, all the speeches, all the votes. And this was what it meant. He held the napkin like a sacred document. It was tear-stained. He didn't know her name, but he didn't need to. Later that night, he walked into the Lincoln Memorial alone. No cameras, no staff. He placed the napkin at the foot of the statue, whispered a prayer, and stood in silence. As he turned to leave, his phone buzzed. A text from Fetterman. Doc says I'm good to come back next week. I'll bring the donuts. You bring the fire. J.D. smiled, then replied, Deal. Let's finish what we started. The Senate chamber was full again. Cameras were everywhere, but this time they were quiet, respectful, watching. Vice President J.D. Vance and Senator John Fetterman walked in side by side. No podium, no speeches, just 2 men. J.D. took the mic briefly. I stood here weeks ago, ready to fight, but I left here changed because of him. He nodded toward Fetterman. Politics didn't make that hug happen. Humanity did, pain did, and healing is what came next. Then he stepped back and let the silence speak. The chamber stood. One by one, senators who never agreed on anything before began to applaud. Some wept. C-SPAN cut to families of veterans watching live. A mother placed her hand on the screen. A little girl whispered, "That's the man who saved Daddy." Back at the Capitol, J.D. turned toward Fetterman and gave him a small nod. Not a performance, not a stunt, just a promise. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real in a world full of noise, leave a comment. Tell us who your hug would go to. Like this video if you believe empathy still matters in politics. Subscribe so you never miss the stories that truly matter. And remember, one moment of human connection can rewrite the course of history. You just witnessed one.